The 1300s weren't kind to the people of France. The 100 Years' War broke out in 1337, the Black Death swept through the continent starting in 1346, and the Kingdom of France would lose a capable king in 1380. This was the world King Charles VI had to deal with when he rose to power. From the very beginning of his reign, he was already dealing with peasant revolts, and it wouldn't take long before his time as a ruler broke him. On a mission to avenge his advisor's attempted assassination, King Charles would first descend into insanity. Subsequent tragedies would leave him mentally crippled for the rest of his life. King Charles VI would descend into a level of mental anguish so severe that he believed he was made of glass, and would eventually be referred to as Charles the Mad. But the strange thing is, he wasn't the only one. This is the story of King Charles VI and his glass delusion, and this is Learn Something New. King Charles VI was born in Paris, France on December 3rd, 1368. He was the son of King Charles V, who would pass away when Charles VI was just 11 years old, making him King of France, though in name only. Still considered too young to rule, control over France was temporarily handed over to a council of his 4 uncles, led by Philip the Bold. At this point, France was just 43 years into the 100 Years' War with England, causing tensions within the country to near a boiling point. In 1382, tax increases set off many French peasants who revolted against the government. Suppression of the revolts took up much of the council's time, and by the time Charles VI was 20 years old, they gave him the power to rule. He used this newfound power to put an end to the civil unrest. The new ruler of France seemed to have a good head on his shoulders and appeared healthy in every way, and he would commonly be referred to as Charles the Well-Beloved, though this wouldn't last. In 1392, Charles VI had his first recorded encounter with psychosis after one of his advisors and a close friend was nearly assassinated. After the assassin, Pierre de Craon, fled to Brittany, France, Charles pursued, hoping to get revenge on the man who sought to kill his friend. When the king was making his way to Brittany with his army, those around him would report that he seemed off, appearing in a hurry and seeming disconnected when speaking to him. When they were well on their way, traveling through a forest, a peasant ran up to the king, yelling that the king had been betrayed and that he should turn around immediately. He was able to follow the party for half an hour, ranting all along the way. This likely put Charles on edge, but it would be just a few hours later, after a page accidentally dropped his lance, which clanged loudly against armor, that the king would be set off. At the sound, he drew his sword and yelled, "Forward against the traitors, they wish to deliver me to the enemy." He swung his sword wildly at everyone around him, killing at least one knight, but some reports state that the number was as high as 5. When they ultimately brought the king down from his horse, he laid on the ground and temporarily fell into a coma. Charles would spend much of his time recovering from this instance, but less than a year later, he would end up suffering another tragedy. In the first week of 1393, the French court put on a celebration of one of the Queen's ladies-in-waiting's upcoming marriages. As part of the party's entertainment, King Charles VI, along with 5 fellow knights, were putting on a show where they posed as wild men, half human, half beast, dancing around the ballroom while chained together. The costumes were made of linens and dried grass to resemble hair, making them extremely flammable. As a precautionary measure, it was declared that no open flames were allowed in the room during the performance. But the king's own brother, who had been out drinking with his entourage, came in late, carrying torches. All it took was a single spark, and in an instant, the fire spread from one knight to the next, engulfing the group in flames. A quick-thinking young duchess in attendance, Duchess de Berry, threw clothing over Charles, smothering the flames and saving the king's life. But although one other knight managed to save himself by pouring wine on the flames, the other 4 would perish. The event would shamefully become known as the Bal des Ardents, or the Ball of the Burning Men, and would further weigh on Charles's fractured psyche. From here, Charles would begin repeatedly experiencing increasingly severe bouts of psychosis. In 1393, Charles would have an episode where he couldn't remember his own name. He didn't know that he was king, and he fled in terror when approached by his wife. Despite recognizing his brother and counselors, he couldn't recognize his own children. In later instances, he would move throughout the palace, howling like a wolf. and eventually began to suffer from delusions that he was made of glass, at risk of shattering from physical contact with other people. The man that would one day be recognized as Pope Pius II wrote that Charles VI's condition was so severe that he had iron rods sewn into his clothing so that if he were to fall, he wouldn't break. Charles the Well-Beloved had become Charles the Mad to all those around him. But surprisingly, Charles VI wasn't the only one who believed he was made of glass. The glass delusion actually existed long before Charles was born. Before it was recognized as people believing that they were made of glass, Rufus of Ephesus wrote in the 2nd century AD of a man who believed he consisted of large pieces of pottery that could shatter with the slightest impact. Those that suffered from this condition were considered the earthenware men. But as time went on and new technologies came forth, the perception of one's fragility shifted. Some saw the invention of transparent glass as alchemy, transmuting sand into another form. Charles VI likely would have as well, with numerous alchemists within his court, even making attempts himself to discover the philosopher's stone, which was believed to turn lead into gold. But when diluted with ideas of transmutation, it could spiral into ideas about the self, with one historian, Gil Speake, believing those with the glass delusion could have viewed themselves as products of their own trauma, with Charles VI destroyed by fire, then transmuted into glass, just as the furnace does with sand. Now, fragile as glass, he had to keep everyone and everything at a distance so that he might avoid ever being hurt again. Stories of glass men would continue to crop up throughout Europe over the next centuries, many of these cases being far more likely to affect the wealthier, more powerful people of societies, or at least it was those that were more wealthy and powerful that the royal physicians bothered to keep a record of. The idea of glass people was prevalent enough that a German alchemist in the 1600s wrote in his book Physica Subterranea that man, like all animals, is glass and can return to glass, claiming that he could turn dead bodies into glass for people that wanted to have glass statues of their deceased loved ones. It's believed that by the 1830s, nearly all cases of glass delusion had dissipated because people had a better understanding of health in the human body. Though some psychiatrists point to the fact that around the time the glass delusion began to disappear, a delusion of people believing themselves to be made of concrete began to show up, showing that the mental illness may not have gone away, but rather evolved, adapting to the new technologies of its era. Charles VI would continue to struggle with mental illness for the rest of his life, and it would have very real impacts on the French Empire. King Henry V had managed to turn the tide of the 100 Years' War by 1415 and actually invaded France. When the King of England came forward to discuss a treaty with the French, it was Queen Isabeau of Bavaria, King Charles's wife, who attended the negotiations. By 1420, Charles was almost entirely incapacitated from his illness, and was pressured into signing the Treaty of Troyes with the King of England. This treaty was devastating for France, and said that King Henry V and his heirs would inherit the French throne as soon as King Charles VI passed away, effectively giving France to the English. And this likely would have gone through if not for the chaos both nations were thrown into just 2 years later, when Charles VI and Henry V died within just 2 months of each other, giving King Charles's son, Charles VII, the opportunity to seize the throne for himself and attack the English with the help of Joan of Arc, driving back the invading forces and allowing the French Empire the breathing room it needed to keep the fight going. Thank you for watching Learn Something New. If you enjoyed this video, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel. And if you want to help the channel out further, please consider checking out the channel's Patreon, linked below in the description. I cannot thank the channel's patrons enough for their support in making these videos possible. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.